and upon Hal and upon Maria that are experiencing health issues. We're grateful to hear a report that Jeannie is doing better, Father, and that it's a possibility that she may be able to go home. And we would ask that you would help her to continue to work towards this. Father, we're asking you to be with David as he teaches our class tonight, and help him with the things that he wants us to learn. Help us all as students to approach the study of your word with open minds. Be with the leaders of our land, Father, and be with those of us who will be making choices in the next few months. Help us to be wise, and those people that we put into our leadership positions, that they'll make godly decisions in leading our nation in the way that they should go. It's in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.
All right, I think we're online here. Yep. All right, let's open up to Mark chapter 13. So we're working our way through this great gospel. Again, that's Mark chapter 13. I hear several of us coughing tonight in one way or another, so I am especially encouraged by your presence in that respect. Because I know this time of year brings under the weather kind of health. But Mark chapter 13, we're continuing to look at some of the events that Mark records for us that are occurring in Jerusalem. Again, we're just days away from the crucifixion at this point in Mark's gospel. Now, up to this point, Mark has recorded something about Jesus' dealings with the religious leaders, as well as something about the things that Jesus taught. And it's in that context that as we come into chapter 13, Mark records some more teachings from Jesus that begin with Mark recording in verse 1 of this chapter, where he writes, as he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, behold, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." So again, this is one of those stage-setting verses that I like to point out. What's happening here in verse 1 of chapter 13? They're admiring the buildings. And where are they? I mean, they're in Jerusalem, but what part of Jerusalem? Near the temple, in the temple area. Now, the temple was a very beautiful place, that the temple itself and the area around it. So yes, one of Jesus' followers, we might assume it's one of the apostles, but that's not specifically said at this point, pointing out, Jesus, look at how great this place is. Wonderful stones, wonderful buildings. Now, with that in mind, one thing we should understand from this verse is that what this unnamed follower of Jesus is doing in saying these things is exhibiting the pride that nearly every Jew had at this part of the world, in the area in and around the temple. Now, why would they have that pride within the temple and the area around it? Okay, it was part of their heritage. Any other thoughts? Okay, it was built by their ancestors. That's true. Well, what was so special about the temple itself? The dwelling place of God. The temple, for the Jew, the temple is where you went to meet God. Now, part of the reason this is fresh in my mind, at least, even though it's been several years, when Desiree and I went to Israel, went to Jerusalem, one of the places we went was this temple area. And I think we're all familiar with what's called the Wailing Wall, where people go to pray and stuff. I didn't know this before we went there, but part of the reason that area is so special is because before the temple was destroyed, that was the back side of the temple. Still is. And so the way our tour guide described it was that was God's backyard. It was right outside where the priest and everybody would go to meet God. This is inevitably something the Jews were very proud of. And that's part of the reason this unnamed follower makes these observations. Jesus, look at how great this place is. This is where God is. These wonderful stones, wonderful buildings. That's where this statement is coming from. The pride the Jews had in the temple itself and in the area surrounding it. Questions or comments on verse 1? Okay. So that brings us into verse 2. We look at Jesus' response to what's said. Text says, and Jesus said to him, do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another which will not be torn down. What's happening here in verse 2? Okay, he's definitely telling them what's going to be happening in the future. What's going to happen in the future? Destruction. Now, I want us to tie this in with verse 1. This unnamed follower has said what he's said. Jesus responds in this way. How's the unnamed follower feeling at this point? What's that, Dad? About that tall, and Elaine said pretty deflated. Like, what? All this great stuff's going to be destroyed, Jesus? And we're going to get into more of the discussion that ensues this. But yeah, this follower would be, as I read it in a commentary, humbled. That pride that is in this building would be destroyed. Now I want us to put us more in this circumstance. Imagine Jesus standing out here at our front doors and we're saying, Jesus, look at this great building that was built. All this money went into it to help make this possible. And then Jesus says this. You see that steeple up there? It's going to be gone. Nothing of this building is going to be left. How would you feel? And I'm not asking that rhetorically. How would you feel? Crickets. Okay, like you've been egotistical. Any other thoughts? Okay. All right. So that's what Jesus' response elicits, as Elaine put. Might be devastated, especially, I mean, Dad, were you here when this building was built? You were, weren't you? Yeah. Who? I'm just curious, who was here? Dean, Sandy, Matt, and Dina, Jessica? Most of us in here. And then you hear Jesus say this. See this great steeple? See the words Church of Christ there? Going to be gone. But Jesus, as Elaine put, we put blood, sweat, and tears. I know. It's going to be gone. I know I'm harping on this, but this is what's going on in the text at this point. You have this disciple, he's proud of the temple, proud of everything that's associated with it. Jesus says this, and that pride is gone. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
At their time. And what represented to them was the presence of God, but really was, I mean, in the Old Testament times, there was, there was the most holy place, and what was in there?
It's the Ark of the Covenant.
Where's the Ark of the Covenant?
Yeah.
In Jesus' time. It's not in the temple.
Truth.
We don't.
Kind of disappears in the Old Testament.
We make movies in the 20th century. They made movies about what might happen to the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah.
They don't know what happened to the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
But this most holy place, which is where the mercy seat, and that was where God was supposed to be residing. The Jewish people let that get out of their hands.
That's true.
So, and that's where the sacrifices were offered, the yearly sacrifices on the mercy seat. So, I think that they were taking a lot of pride in a building that not so sure that even at their time, that God really resided in that building.
Right. And that's some application of these two verses. And we're not done. We're going to keep going with this. But yeah, the Jews put pride in the building. Application, we can be guilty of that too. We put pride in the building. Building's not where God lives, because God's everywhere. But we do get into this mindset. The Jews got into this mindset. This is the building. It's the temple. But Jesus says what he says. It's going to be destroyed. And this is what's going to segue into what we're going to be dealing with tonight. But just one final note on what Jesus says here. Something else we should understand from what Jesus says here, and I was talking to Dad a little bit about this on the right here. What Jesus says here functions as a prediction. It's already been said of what's going to happen in the future. It's a prediction that the temple, as well as the city of Jerusalem, would at some point be destroyed in the future. You look at history, it occurred in 70 AD. I mean, that's a well-documented fact. When Jesus says these words, it's roughly some 35 to 40 years before the temple and Jerusalem itself are destroyed. Anything else on verses 1 and 2? Go ahead.
Did God ever request the temple to be built?
Actually, yeah, he was quite happy with the tabernacle when he looked at it. Yeah.
To be built, but he never did. The temple, the idea of building a building for God was David and Solomon.
Right. That's true. That is true. We also see that in the Old Testament, that God was quite happy with the tabernacle. He didn't ask for anything beyond that as far as where the sacrifices were made are concerned. Anything else on verses 1 and 2? Okay. So verse 3, move a little bit forward. The conversation has taken place in verses 1 and 2. Verse 3, Mark says, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew were questioning him privately. So we still don't know who the disciple was in verse 1. But jump forward to verse 3. that conversation is taking place. What's happening here in verse 3? Say that again, Dean. Okay, we learn, yes, there are some apostles named here, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, but what are they doing? Talking to him privately. Where are they when this conversation takes place? On the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple. Now, this is another verse that brings to mind what Desiree and I experienced on our trip. The Mount of Olives is situated, I lost the direction. But anyway, point being, Desiree and I visited the Mount of Olives. And on the side where the text says Jesus is, you can see Jerusalem very clearly. It's a very beautiful view. You can see where the temple, at least present day, you can see where the temple was. But in Jesus' time, you could see the temple very clearly from the Mount of Olives. And so the temple's still in view when these four apostles are asking Jesus these questions. What are the questions about? Before this destruction, when will it happen? And that's right, and we'll get that there into verse 4. But yes, these are the questions they're asking. And that brings us into verse 4, that Elaine pointed us toward. They're asking, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? What are they asking in that question? Okay, tell us when to be prepared, but they also say, what will be the sign? What is a sign? It's a marker. It's something that points you in a direction. Going out here on Highway 6, toward Wellington, beyond, you start seeing signs, I-70 this way, so many miles, et cetera, et cetera. That's what they're asking. What is going to be the indicator that these things are going to happen? Now, sign, the word sign in the Bible we sometimes associate it with miracles, and that's fine, but it's not always miracles. It's just a word that means a pointer, a director, to something that directs something to beyond itself. Sorry, I rambled there. But yes, they're asking this question. They're asking Jesus, when is this going to happen? How are we going to know that it's going to happen? So what the apostles want to know is when the words of Jesus were going to be fulfilled and how they could know when those words were going to be fulfilled. Anything else in verses 3 and 4? Okay. So verses 1 through 4. They set the stage for how Jesus goes on to answer this question and the other questions these apostles had in verses 5 through 8, where we run into the words of Jesus, and he makes 2 points that not only deal with this question that is related to the destruction of Jerusalem, but it's also ultimately related to his second coming when everything would be destroyed. So as I told Dad on the drive here, what Mark 13 deals with, it intertwines both the end of the world and the destruction of Jerusalem. And we are going to slow down through this chapter, and that's why we're only looking at verses 1 through 8 tonight, but more specifically verses 5 through 8 with the time we have left. And again, Jesus makes 2 points about his words and when and how they would be fulfilled. In verses 5 and 6, the words of Jesus would be fulfilled after people would come to mislead many. And the second point Jesus makes in verses 7 and 8 is that the words of Jesus would be fulfilled after painful events would take place. We're going to be looking at some heavy stuff tonight. I'm going to warn you right now. But it's stuff I think we need to know and understand. But after looking at these things, what we'll learn from these verses is that we have to have the proper perspective on when the words of Jesus will be fulfilled. So we'll read verses 5 through 8, then we'll look at the points. Again, Mark chapter 13, beginning in verse 5, we read, "And Jesus began to say to them, 'See to it that no one misleads you. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and will mislead many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be frightened. Those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will also be famines. These things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. So again, we're looking at 2 points about when the words of Jesus would be fulfilled. Point number 1, his words would be fulfilled after people would come to mislead many. Beginning in verse 5, Jesus establishes a point. He says, see to it that no one misleads you. So the question I want to ask here, what does it mean to mislead someone? Misdirect them, okay. Any other thoughts? Pulls them away from what they're intending. And you had something, Dad? To deceive. So it is the idea of deception. It's a word that has to do with also leading astray, but there are a lot of ideas there. Ones you've brought up definitely tie in with it. So what's Jesus saying here in verse 5? It's the idea of being on guard. Make sure you aren't led astray. Make sure you're not deceived. Questions or comments on verse 5? Okay, let's go to verse 6. So Jesus said in verse 5, see to it that no one misleads you. And in verse 6, what does he go on to say? What's going to happen? They're going to pretend to be the Christ. But yes, Jesus makes this statement, many will come in my name. What does that mean? With his authority. People are going to come claiming to have the authority of Jesus. Not only that, they'd go so far as to claim that they're Jesus himself. But we have to ask, well, how does this build on verse 5? As this builds on what Jesus said in verse 5, what is said here functions as a reason his followers needed to be on guard. Because this is what's going to happen. And not only is it going to happen, you look back through history, it has happened. There have been people who have come with the authority of Jesus. There are still people who claim to come with the authority of Jesus. But some people have come claiming to be Jesus himself. But Jesus warns, they're misleading you. Be on guard against that. Questions or comments on verse 6? Okay. So putting verses 5 and 6 together, tying it in with the question that's been asked by Jesus' apostles, the point we should see about when Jesus' words would be fulfilled is that Jesus' words would be fulfilled after people would come to mislead many. Now in these verses, Jesus has shown that people were coming to mislead others. In context, what he says here has to do with the fact that his words would be fulfilled sometime after this occurred. This misleading is still going on today. So the fulfillment of Jesus' words is coming, but it hasn't happened yet. I think all of us in here would agree with that. So what this should help us understand is that the words of Jesus here function to show us that as long as there's these kinds of people who are misleading others by claiming to have the authority of Jesus and claiming to be Jesus, Jesus' words will not be fulfilled. Now, who's going to bring that misleading to an end? Jesus. This misleading is still going on. And so that means Jesus hasn't come yet. It's only he that's going to bring it to an end completely. So that brings us into verses 7 and 8, the second point. We're going to spend some time. The words of Jesus will be fulfilled after painful events would take place. Beginning there in verse 7, we see the beginning of a list. What does Jesus say there in verse 7? Okay. So what does that mean? There's going to be wars. But it doesn't mean it's the end of the world yet. So here's where we're beginning to see that Jesus is intertwining the destruction of Jerusalem that he just predicted, but as well as the end of the world. And that's what makes Mark 13 kind of difficult, because it's intertwined, both of those events into one chapter. But what does he say to his followers? How should his followers respond to these things? Do not be troubled. Jessica's read, do not be alarmed. Do not be frightened. Don't worry about these things, is the idea. You've got the war in Ukraine that's been going on. That's one of the most recent wars. You've had all these wars throughout history, but Jesus says, don't worry about those things. Don't be afraid of those things, because the end has not yet come. And so, similar to the misleading discussion that we just had, here he's also saying these wars, these rumors of wars, they're going to keep going on. Wars aren't going to end until that point when Jesus brings them to an end. But the thought continues into verse 8. Verse 8, the list continues. What other things are going to take place according to verse 8? Okay. What else is on that list? Earthquakes and famines. What do all these things have in common? Destruction. They're not good. Everything Jesus has listed from verse 7 to this point, things that bring pain. And this is just a small list of examples. But putting all these things together, they're things that bring pain into people's lives. Painful things are going to continue. Painful things, difficult things. But again in verse 7, how are Jesus' followers to respond? Not to be alarmed, to not be afraid. Just because these things are happening, this doesn't mean it's the end of the world. And we need to know that, because there are religious groups claiming to have the authority of Jesus who have said, well, Iraq, war in Iraq, the war in Ukraine, all these wars going on, it's the end of the world, people. No, it's not. What does Jesus say it is? There at the end of the verse. Beginning of birth pangs. What are birth pangs, ladies? Pain. What do birth pangs indicate? Baby's coming. But what does Jesus mean? Okay, new life, that's the coming of a baby, but this is in the context of painful stuff. Jesus says the wars, the rumors of wars, the earthquakes, famines, nations going against each other, it's the beginning of birth pangs. Now, what does that mean, the beginning? What does that word mean? It's a start. The start of what is the question we have to ask here. Something is coming. All these painful circumstances, these things are bringing difficulty into the world, show that something is coming. What's coming after all these things have taken place? What's going to be the end? Who's coming? Eternity. So we have to remember that one of the questions that the apostles have asked, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, one thing they want to know, well, what's the sign? In these things that Jesus has listed, he's answered that question. Well, here's the sign. Wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, famines, nation rising against nation. This is how you know the end is coming. But Jesus has also made the point, the end has not yet come. But all these things you see going on in the world, that's the sign that the end is coming. But it hasn't happened yet. These things will continue until they don't. I know I've given a lot of information. Questions or comments on verses 7 and 8? Probably. Probably. Exactly. And that's what part of the reason Jesus says, do not be frightened. Don't worry. It's not the end yet. So, go ahead. That's true. It's Joseph, yeah. For centuries on end. Yeah. Any other questions or comments over 7 and 8? So again, we're dealing with the question that was asked of Jesus. The point here in verses 7 and 8, when will those words be fulfilled? They'd be fulfilled after painful events would take place. Now in these verses, Jesus has shown that certain events needed to take place before his words would come to fulfillment. Some of those things that needed to take place were wars, rumors of wars, nations and kingdoms rising up against each other, earthquakes, famines, all other painful events you can name. Those will take place before his words are fulfilled. But the point he wants his followers to understand in these things, do not be frightened. Don't be afraid. These are just things that need to happen before the end comes. We don't know how long those things are going to happen, but they're going to happen until they don't. So as a result of these things in verses 5 and as in verses 5 and 6, his followers were not to be misled into believing the end is here when these things are happening. Again, when you look at verses 5 through 8, Jesus is just giving a list of things that are going to happen before the end take place. You have what we might call false teachers coming, and then you have all these other painful and difficult circumstances of this world that will happen. But the end is not yet here, so do not be afraid. So, putting verses 1 through 8 together of this chapter, Mark, the point we should be left with is that the words of Jesus would not be fulfilled until after certain things took place. One of those things that needed to take place was people would come to mislead many. The words of Jesus would not be fulfilled until after painful events took place. So what we should learn from these things is that we must have the proper perspective on when the words of Jesus would be fulfilled. Now, based on what we have studied in these verses, the words of Jesus we read here indicate that our perspective on the things Jesus has spoken should be one where we understand that his words will not be fulfilled until certain things take place. One of those things that must take place is that people must be misled, or people coming to mislead others. Also, according to these verses, something else that must take place before the words of Jesus are fulfilled is that painful events must occur. Now, if we understand that, then we'll be able to see that the things going on in this world that fit into this description Jesus has given are not signs that the end has already begun, but they're signs that the end is coming. So as a result of these things, the main point Jesus has made is that we do not need to be afraid of these things going on. but instead we ought to be encouraged to continue on in our faithfulness to Jesus so that when the end does come, Jesus will find us living faithfully toward him. Again, those are just some applications. Any other questions or comments? Elaine? Yeah, at this point, only his Father knows, yeah. So, any other questions or comments? All right. Dean, will you close us tonight?